This is 235 days after the release of Marvel's Avengers. 235 days. Every single thing you're seeing right now, and for the rest of this video, is 235 days later, after launch. This is the state of one of the most hyped games of the last decade. This is Captain America taking an invisible shield he doesn't have to finish an enemy hit by nothing before returning that nothingness back to an invisible shield holder. I played a lot of Avengers at launch on console. I dove in deep on the endgame and did my absolute best to give it a fair shake. I bounced off of it within 3 weeks. I came back for each new piece of content and found myself in a stranger and stranger state of mind each time I started something new. So recently I decided to hop over to PC, start up a fresh account, and clean slate it. In the meantime though, this game has become one of the strangest derailed trains on the market. Its publisher has made absolutely baffling decisions with post-launch content. The updates have sometimes slapped players right across the face, and it almost seems like the game is completely directionless. So here's how and why Marvel's Avengers became, well, something that's unrecognizable from what was promised. And some of it is just strange. This was an attempt to capitalize on Marvel hype. You probably heard this a lot over the past few months. How did Crystal Dynamics not learn from Anthem or Destiny? But I actually think there's a far more pressing question. How did they not learn from Star Wars Battlefront? This is a real article. It's about how Crystal formed the Avengers of game development pre-release. What's it say? Well, it's just a giant red flag being waved pre-release. Crystal Dynamics spent that last 15 years making single-player Tomb Raider games. They knew this. So what did they do? Well, Square helped them add an entirely new support studio, and in their words, rebuilt the entire infrastructure of the studio current because they knew they weren't currently equipped to make the game. They went and recruited dozens of industry vets, some from Naughty Dog and the closed Visceral Games. So what happens when you hand a game to a studio who knows they aren't ready to make that game and has to rework the entire studio and build a new one to make it happen? Well, a mess, of course. There was no way this was going to turn out well. So what made them and Square so confident in this decision? Well, it's easy. The name. This is exactly what went wrong with Battlefront. The first Battlefront game was a content-deplete mess of a title, but EA forced it out because they knew people would buy anything that says Star Wars. Battlefront 2 was an even bigger mess, but again, Star Wars. Square and Crystal believed that it didn't matter whether or not they were the best team for the job, because the Avengers name alone would drive sales. The second licensed games became big AAA projects, companies began hiding behind those licenses and using them to inflate a false sense of confidence in both the developers and the consumers. And boy, oh boy, was that confidence false. Almost everything that could go wrong once the game hit people's screens was already wrong. Let's start with the core experience. The 11 or so hour campaign, and yes, you heard that right, the 11-hour campaign, is something worth talking about. Let's ignore the length for now and talk about what this is. Here's what went right. Kamala, a character I've been reading since the very first Ms. Marvel rebooted issue, and Bruce's story here is excellent. The writing and VO work here is top-notch. That core emotional narrative arc is great and carries the weight of that campaign well. But again, somehow the game's writers did not learn from their massive influences. And this time I don't mean Destiny, I don't mean Battlefront, I mean the Marvel movies themselves. You know what the Avengers movies get right? They know that these heroes are better when sharing the screen than they are when they're isolated from one another. Watch the 4 Avengers movies and try to count how many times heroes are completely alone. This game's story does the worst thing it can do. It spends half the campaign completely isolating the heroes in an effort to teach you the ropes. That sucks. And as a result, it all feels incredibly disjointed, like a bunch of different demos for individual Marvel games played one after the other. But playing them does hit the mark 50% of the time. The gameplay here is fun. I absolutely love high-level gameplay with characters like Iron Man and Hulk. There's nuance in the combo-based combat system. This shallow upgrade tree, which does open up at mastery a bit, keeps things relatively fresh, and decimating people with Thor doesn't really get old. The Avengers all feel unique in play and practice, but the problem is once you get past that, once you've spent a few hours with it, you've had your fill of that play, almost every moment of the game becomes a tedious task of two-button boredom. Mash, mash, mash. Oop, one enemy needs a new strat. He's gone. Okay, mash, mash, mash. You've heard it a million times already about this game, and it's simply true. You can get more interesting and dive deeper with how you play, but while it may make you feel better and it might look a little bit cooler to any bystanders, it won't make you really all that more or less successful in the game, even with more current tweaks. Which is a shame because the combat system feels so great to play and is the one shining bright spot here. But then all the characters get together, and then every level has no choice but to fit the gameplay realities of each and every one of them. This is why Marvel Ultimate Alliance puts every character on the same playing field, literally. An obvious problem for this kind of game. So instead of getting creative here and focusing on building each level from the perspective of one hero at a time, challenging different kinds of heroes on different levels to solve this problem, they instead turn each level into a boring, uninspired landscape of mob control that's not fresh to play for any one character, but technically works for all of them. It all blends together so fast and begins to feel so generic. Or worse, you get crap like this mid-campaign where you have to fly around as Tony for 10 minutes, which is really not fun whatsoever. It's straight barrel roll. It feels like it was ripped out of like a 2006 licensed Iron Man game. What makes this worse, all of this, is once friends get involved, fights become a mess of pure, sometimes random fists flying in every direction. At higher levels, again, more nuance, but in general, this is what you're gonna get. However, one of the game's biggest sins is that you spend half of those 10-11 hours in plain clothes running around a ship or walking through forest or bases and engaging with context-sensitive crap. There's probably 5 or 6 actual hours of gameplay here in the campaign. Seriously, the other 4 or 5 are spent doing things that have literally nothing to do with what was promised from the game. Worse yet, the pacing of that gameplay in the story when you are playing it is at times horrendous. Every 10 seconds you're hit with a QTE or a context-sensitive moment. I opened like 5 of these iPad touches here for absolutely no reason in 3 or 4 minutes. I don't know if they're hiding loading or if they're just here to pad the level's playtime, but they are pace halting and everywhere. But let me tell you right now, where Avengers has truly frustrated me isn't here, it's everything that has come since. 96% player base drop. 96%. Drops are expected post-launch, obviously, but this one, it was earned. So let me give you some post-launch context. The consensus post-launch was that leveling your character was fine, maybe even a little grindy because of, well, the lack of fun sometimes. But what Square likely found was that players were leveling up quickly, realizing the endgame sucked, and then bouncing after they hit the level cap. So instead of fixing the endgame and making it more enjoyable to keep players around, what do? Square artificially increases the XP required to level up, making the leveling process even more of a grind. A blatant attempt to manipulate consumers into feeling like they're getting more for their money and hopefully sticking around longer to, pay for those optional microtransactions, which are, by the way, truly optional, so that's a plus. We who follow gaming news saw this and reacted accordingly, but what Square and Crystal are betting on is that the average consumer has no idea any of this is happening. That sucks. What sucks more is that in doing this, they add insult to this injury. Yeah, the game had serious, very real technical issues at launch. Not only were they not getting fixed at a reasonable clip, but in the process, they also were delaying content, feasibly to fix the very things that weren't getting fixed. And there are still a ton of technical issues, so while they're increasing grind, they're forcing you to sit through stuff like this. This is, again, recent, right now. This is my current gameplay. This is what they were supposed to be delaying content to fix. And by delays, I mean Kate Bishop was delayed, and then the next gen release was delayed, and then Spider-Man was delayed, and that was as recently as this past month. So why does this all matter? Well, Avengers is an RPG, a looter, and all of this impacts a simple reality. It does not know what either of those two terms mean. As an RPG at and post-launch, Avengers has failed in almost every way. Think about how cool it could have been to make a looter like Destiny or Borderlands with Marvel characters. How absolutely crazy you could have decked out Thor. What a new hammer that's shaped like a bat with spikes sticking out of it would have been with Thor wielding it. How cool any creativity at all would have made this game. Sure, the argument could be made that Marvel didn't want them screwing with the costumes and characters, which is likely why loot has almost no aesthetic impact. Marvel likely wanted them to not mess with the way these characters looked, but that leaves me asking, then why bother at all? As a looter, this game is last in the pack. The loot here is absolutely subpar. It comes very quickly, which is great, but it's often just plain boring, especially when it comes to characters like Hulk and Ms. Marvel. The whole point of a looter's endgame is to push for better loot. If the loot sucks, in turn, so too does your endgame. And for the most part, the loot sucks. And it especially sucks when a good majority of it has literally no aesthetic impact at all. Again, the loot becomes nothing more than numbers at that point, as opposed to something exciting and worth chasing. There are some exceptions at higher levels to this rule, but man, are they incredibly few and far between. Not only that, but because the skill trees in this game are so vapid until you get to mastery, and I mean, they really are up until that point as light as they come, the loot is what has to be relied on to truly change the way you play your characters. And actually, once you hit the level cap, it has to be that way in the endgame too, and because of the nature of these Marvel characters, that's usually all but impossible. So what you get once you reach level cap is basically how you're gonna play the game forever. So why stay? And it won't matter because the endgame is substanceless content-wise. All these days later, it is still repeating the same tired mission objectives and beating the same tired story bosses over and over again. So what fun you're actually having playing the game is slowly sucked out by the pure repetition of the endgame content. And this is my biggest gripe. It's not a technical problem, this is not a whoopsie, we didn't see this coming. Square clearly, transparently did not give Crystal Dynamics the time they needed to finish this game properly, content-wise. They had no real plan for endgame content. The endgame to this day feels like it was cobbled together with assets in a single meeting. It's almost insulting, and it brings me to the thing that is so aggressively strange to me about this game. The character roadmap, the free character roadmap that keeps getting delayed, is kind of insulting. This game dramatically lacked content at launch, and to hype up free characters post-release only to have them drop and have this happen? Yeah, so far Avengers DLC characters have been incredibly short romps through entirely forgettable pieces of content. In fact, given how much they hyped them up, it might be the most frustrating part of this post-launch content. Why even bother pretending like you're adding all of this substance when you know what you're giving your players? To have all of that be the case, once again reinforces a publisher putting a studio in a situation without the time or resources to feel their way through it. What we keep seeing consistently is studios putting out games that are not ready to be put out for their financial calls, for their earnings calls, for stockholders, to increase and inflate their value at a specific period of time. However, they do this, it's not done, and then they go, okay, that roadmap we showed you, all that post-launch content, that's gonna be delayed so that we can fix the game. But then they don't fix the game, they delay the content, and the content isn't enough of an apology. What's much more simple for Avengers would have been including this content in the game and launching it a year later, not having to use it as an apology to make up for mistakes that you already aren't fixing. The Clint and Kate DLCs probably would have been fine and forgivable had they just been there day one and not been DLC at all. If you want people to be stoked about your roadmap post-launch, maybe be ready to deliver on that content before you launch the game. And I don't mean have the content finished, be ready with a finished game so that you can focus on that post-launch content exclusively, and maybe these things won't happen. Look, the overarching problem with this game is sort of foundational. The problem with character familiarity, like we have here with Marvel and their characters, is that it does become difficult for a studio like this to truly be creative with both those characters and their stories. But again, also it's loot. I think it probably works for games like Lego Marvel's Avengers because Marvel probably isn't as picky about how they dress Lego figurines. And this all brings me to the question that I've had running through my head for 2 years. Why then? Why in the world is this game a live service, loot-based RPG? Why is this game in the same genre as Destiny? I mean, I know the answer, it's money. Live service games drive microtransactions, DLC, the whole nine. But why this? This game is not going to be No Man's Sky because its problems are foundational, again, to what it is at its very core. Marvel's characters simply aren't built for loot grind. Marvel's preciousness over how they're represented and presented is clearly too restrictive, unless you can think of another excuse for the lack of loot creativity in a game about loot. The characters here are too pervasive in popular culture to not have Hulk picking up enemies and Loki slamming them, so now you're also restricting yourself in how they move, which after 100 hours does become a gameplay issue. And you're taking a series that is one of the most ubiquitous names in the world, at the end of 15 years of movies telling stories that billions of people love, into a genre that is notoriously difficult to tell a real story in. What makes all of this so confusing is that you don't need to do literally any of this. Not a single one of those aforementioned things, and your game would have made more money and been more profitable. Likely even set up a franchise. By doing what? The only intelligent thing to have done here, the exact opposite. Create a more substantive and interesting co-op RPG, a game that's just as fun alone as with friends. You go ahead and you still hire those people from Naughty Dog and Visceral because you've also spent 20 years making amazing single-player Tomb Raider games, and you and those people do exactly what you do best. That's literally all you had to do. Make this story bigger, get rid of the live service and endgame grind, and give players something that feels worthy of these characters and their time. Don't take a basketball team and ask them to go play football for a week. They won't win. This incredibly strange trend of publishers taking studios and throwing them into the deep end of genres they are not familiar with is killing games and studios, figuratively and literally. Innovation is great, but it requires time. Crystal wasn't given that time, clearly, and the results speak for themselves. So let's let Marvel's Avengers be a lesson, really to anyone in any field. Stepping out of your comfort zone is scary, it should be. So take small steps, because the slower you walk in creativity, the more you're going to learn, and the better your results. Nothing that evolves overnight ever looks pretty in the morning. Well guys, that's it for today's video, this week's long-form analysis one. Now I want to know what you guys think. What do you think of Marvel's Avengers? What do you think that they could do to maybe make this a better game at this point? Is there anything they can do at all to get you to return to it, and were you interested at all with it to begin with? But my other question is, if there was another studio that was going to make a superhero game, what studio and what game would they make? I'm really curious as to what you guys think and what you can come up with. Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, press that like button. If you haven't yet done so, hit subscribe, and then press the notification bell. That way you actually get notified when I upload. I'm getting like 100 messages a day saying no one's being notified right now, so press the bell so you actually get a notification when I upload. I'm back. I just want to really quickly, one more time, go over the upload and release schedule now. It'll be Wednesdays will be these long form color series analysis type videos, retrospectives, reviews, whatever. Then Friday and Sunday will be traditional news videos, and then Monday will be that week's What a Weird Week series. If you haven't seen that yet, you can check that out in the playlist on the channel. So yeah, hopefully right here and here are 2 more videos on the channel, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.